Thank you so much, April, for your presentation. And I'm here speaking from Hamburg, Germany. I lived in New York until a few months ago. I've moved back to Hamburg, and I'm going to be talking about suffering as a gateway to peace. And just to give you a very short introduction to who I am and what I do. So I work as a coach and a speaker, a researcher, and a writer. And I am interested in understanding the mind and understanding how the mind has the potential to create suffering, and how the mind, the same mind, has the potential to create happiness and peace. And that's what I would like to explore today. My work is my camera, so everybody can see me. I just want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I'm good? Okay, because my own face is just somewhere up there in a box, but okay. So my work is basically positioned at the intersection of Buddhist philosophy and psychology, and neuroscience, psychology, and psychotherapy. So this is a field that's called contemplative science. So the intersection of the Buddhist, and specifically, I'm trained in the Tibetan system. I've been student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for a few years now, and have been studying also in New York with a group of neuroscientists and psychologists. So it's a fascinating emerging field of contemplative science, the understanding of the mind, the relationship between mind and life, or mind and reality, the mind and the brain. So I want to share a little bit that has helped me and really helped me to work with my suffering, to the point when I have, let's say, an experience of anxiety, there is a part of me that actually gets excited. This might sound a little bit masochistic and absurd, but there is a part of me that actually looks forward to sitting down and practicing with the anxiety, with whatever suffering that there may be. In my case, it can manifest as anxiety. And this is an attitude that I hope to impart on the people that are listening now or will listen later, so that when you have an experience that overwhelms you negatively, whether it's an experience of fear, an experience of loneliness, isolation, anxiety, sadness, anger, grief, perhaps, I wish after this call that you will find the inspiration to not just instinctively run away from it and try to avoid it at all costs or try to numb it, but rather find the energy or the motivation to roll up your sleeves and say, you know what, I'm going to sit and work with this. I'm going to go into it rather than let it run its course and influence me. So from the Buddhist point of view, or Buddhist philosophical point of view, suffering, if we look at suffering, it is oftentimes described as that which we don't want to look at. It's that which we want to turn away from. So in Sanskrit, suffering, which the Buddha was talking about a lot, especially in the first noble truth, the truth of suffering, he refers to it as dukkha, and dukkha literally means all pervasive dissatisfaction. So if we look at suffering, there's three types of suffering in the Buddhist view that have been, let's say, discovered. The first is the obvious kind of suffering of death, aging, sickness, the kind of gross level suffering that all of us will be subject to in our lifetimes. And it's unavoidable. The second, a little bit more subtle kind of suffering, is a suffering of change. It's called suffering of change. And that's just a suffering that comes from not being able to hold on to things, not being able to make things permanent, things that are always in flux and always fleeting as we are just starting to enjoy them. So that could be a happy moment, that could be your own body, it could be some kind of life situation. It is always going to be dissolving and fading, right? So there's this sort of bitterness to life in the fact that it's always fleeting and always changing. We can't hold it. But the kind of suffering that I'm going to be talking about today, which is the all-pervasive dissatisfaction, is very, very subtle. This is a psychological suffering that comes from always finding something wrong with the way things are, with the way that I am myself. There's always something I can do to be better. There's always something to gain, to improve on. And then if I look at my life, there's always this nagging sensation that I can fix something, that there's something not quite enough, right? So there's always something off, something wrong. And this dissatisfaction is like a bad taste in your mouth. No matter how much you eat and you try to make it go away, it's always there. And this propels me into acting, into trying to make this dissatisfaction go away, right? And that action is motivated by a desire, right? It's a desire for, let's say, a cessation of this discomfort, a cessation of this dissatisfaction, and a gaining of satisfaction, a gaining of pleasure. Most often, however, the sad thing is that which we strive to gain, that which we see as the source of our happiness, as the thing that will make our dissatisfaction go away, cannot bring about the happiness we seek, right? And so we find ourselves in a way in this kind of distorted perception of how things are, and then we find ourselves in this vicious cycle, continuously seeking happiness in things that are, logically speaking, impossible to be the source of our happiness. However, we are misguided in thinking that that thing will give me happiness. And so we end up in this never-ending state of perpetual dissatisfaction that compels us throughout life to take actions, to seek out careers, to go into relationships, to do so much for ourselves primarily, and in this hope that there will come this final moment when I will lean back and I'll take off my coat and I'll say, I have arrived. This is happiness. This is it. I'm home. And the sad thing is that moment will not come. It will not come in this way. So how do we change this? How do we actually find happiness? And from my understanding and what I have studied in Buddhism, and I think that anyone who actually kind of starts to inquire a little bit will come to the same conclusion, that the way to actually stop this vicious cycle and to begin sort of the path that actually leads to happiness is to become aware, is perhaps to first stop empowering this cycle and become aware of my original motivation. All sentient beings want to be happy, I would say, and no living being or sentient being wants to suffer. So I would say an acknowledgement of our fundamental desire for happiness. So that's, I would say, a good starting point. However, then I think it takes a good deal of realism to then ask oneself, am I happy, right? And I would dare to say that most of us have moments of happiness or moments perhaps of pleasure. But I would say that it's very, very common for most people to acknowledge and admit to themselves that they are unhappy. And I would say that the world we live in, if we were to look at our systems, and some of them are truly being challenged at the moment, are created by minds that are not necessarily happy. These, and we have to, I think, begin with that. Really a difficult acknowledgement of the fact that most of us are not necessarily driven by a deep sense of happiness. We may not even be aware of what that means. What does it really mean to be happy? And in our, especially in Western society, happiness is sold to us as pleasure. It's actually pleasure that is being marketed as happiness. Most people don't even understand. Whereas pleasure is a very dopamine-inspired experience. Whereas if you look at it from a neuroscientific point of view, happiness has often been associated with serotonin release. And serotonin is actually, it produces a state of contentment and calm. It actually makes the craving and the desire for more and the desire for short-term pleasure actually sort of subside. So it's the opposite of wanting, and it's the opposite of craving. Contentment is about contentment is about being happy with everything as it is, with things as they are. And that, I would say, is the closest connection that I can find to happiness, contentment, and the flavor of contentment. And so how often do you, as a viewer, you who are listening to me, actually access contentment? And how often are you thinking that you're happy when you're actually having a moment of pleasure? So I think it begins, the whole journey of working with your suffering and moving towards happiness, which all of us want, begins with being really radically honest with yourself. Are you seeking pleasure? Are you seeking happiness? Are you even aware of what happiness is to you? Have you ever had a moment of happiness? So that kind of honest sort of, just like investigation of your own life and your own habits, particularly your habits of mind. Then I would say, once you've done that, it's time to really do what we oftentimes as pleasure seekers and pain avoiders really don't like to do, which is face your suffering. Acknowledge what is making you suffer. And that takes a lot of courage to do. And it is a fucking uncomfortable process to actually not run, not numb, not call your friend, not make yourself another latte, to not go for a run, to not smoke, to not drink, to not get high, to not go have sex, to not call your girlfriend or boyfriend, but to sit and actually rip off your distorted glasses and say to yourself, these are the things that are making me suffer. Sit down and make a list, right? So practically speaking, start to actually take inventory of the things in your own mind that make you suffer. So like I said, actually, as the Buddha said, so there's things in life that will happen and they will cause a lot of suffering, right? So the Buddha referred to these as the first arrow. Life will throw an arrow at us, the arrow of losing a loved one, the arrow of sickness, the arrow of losing your job. But we have a choice whether or not we want to take a second arrow and throw it at ourselves. And most suffering, psychological suffering, is actually just the second arrow that we ourselves take and throw in our eye and then sit there and, fall apart and blame someone else oftentimes on top of it. So ask yourself, what is the second arrow that you take in addition to all the pain that is unavoidable in life, and you throw at yourself? And why do you do that? And how does it make you suffer? So a really radically intimate acknowledgement of your own suffering and how you yourself are actually perpetuating the suffering machine. And of course, this will inevitably take you to your childhood. This will inevitably invite you to take a really sincere look at your childhood, to really see what may have happened to you. Why have you acquired the habits that you have currently? Why are your behaviors the way they are? What is really motivating you? So that kind of inquiry or self-inquiry, I think, is essential. Again, we are pushing against a lot of resistance and coming in contact with some deep-seated discomfort. Most of us have had our share of developmental trauma. So as children, we may have had certain experiences that left us with certain wounds internally, psychologically. And again, it's not in our nature to want to go to these wounds because they hurt. Most of us may not even have the tools to actually respond to the pain. So we may feel overwhelmed. We may want to just completely run away. We may totally freeze and shut down or break down. So I think, the path of, let's say, personal development, or you call it self-realization, whatever you want to call it, it's all about very gently, very compassionately learning to develop the toolkit, the tools, the resources that allow you to respond to your inner life in a more effective way. It's like learning a language that then you can speak to yourself and to your wounded self. And when you begin to learn to speak that language with your wounded self, using this metaphor now, the wounded self begins to reveal itself. It begins to communicate to you. You don't have to run away from it. You don't have to shut it down or repress it or blame it or judge it. You just learn to speak with it. You have a conversation with it. And so that's sort of what we would call then the gradual healing process. And all of us have, you know, we have an ability to do that. It just comes down to choosing to do that or not. And that's how we begin to turn things around. So I would say inquiry into the nature of our personal suffering. What is causing the suffering? How are my habits actually perpetuating the suffering? So most of you have heard the term karma. And, you know, as karma is not some mystical force that's running the universe. Karma simply means action in Sanskrit. And there are 3 faculties with which we act. We have our body, we can take actions with. We have our speech, you know, our language, our words that we are acting with. And then we have our mind, our process of thinking, our cognition, our perception. So all things related to mind are also how we create karma. So if we are not aware, if we don't have self-awareness, hence mindfulness being so precious, and I'm not talking about secularized pop mindfulness, I'm talking about mindfulness the way that it was meant to be used, as a systematic path towards self-actualization, not as a method for, you know, temporary stress reduction or increased productivity. Mindfulness will allow you to become more aware of the way that you're speaking, of the way that you're thinking, of the way you're acting, so that your actions are not just compulsive, mechanical, hypnotic actions based on prior learning or repetition. Your actions become informed. When you speak, you are aware of the impact that your speech has on your own mind and on others. When you are thinking, you are able to observe the nature of your own thoughts. You are able to observe the quality of your thoughts and the way your thoughts are making you feel, the way your thoughts are flavoring your experience of reality. When you are aware, you can take really deliberate, intelligent action. I mean, what else is intelligence? To me, that is the definition of intelligence. Somebody who has like mastery over their own actions. So most of us sit around and we complain about the world and the state of affairs, and now everyone's complaining about like the lockdown and whatnot. It's like, you are your master. You are the master of your own reality. At least that's what I understand what the great mystics, whether it's from the Sufi tradition, which is where I'm Iranian, so I'm very much inspired by the mystics of Persia and the Sufis. But also all the way to, you know, the Western traditions. I would say ultimately they're all pointing to us, ourselves, maybe not some Abrahamic religions, but I would say the mystical traditions are all somewhat pointing us back to ourselves as the masters of our reality. So again, this is not a mystical procedure. This is simply awareness of your own actions. So, bless you. So I would say, so to make this really practical, and this is something that I love to work with as a coach with my clients, but also with myself. So if you want to change your reality, as simple as that, right? So you're not exactly content. You acknowledge the fact that you are not truly happy, that what you call happiness is pleasure. And you acknowledge the fact that you do want to be happy. So you begin with a simple process, and that is start to first establish awareness, become aware. How do you do that? Very simple. You can start with mindfulness, daily mindfulness practice, or even something more simple than that. As frequently as you can throughout the day, stop and ask yourself, how do I feel right now? And actually inquire. So it's almost like a tuning inwards, what is also referred to as interoception. So start to feel your inner life, feel your body from inside, sense inwards. How am I feeling right now? And then feel the sensations and so on. You can take it even further and say, what is the quality of my mind right now? What kind of tone, what kind of note does my thinking have right now? Is it positive? Is it negative? Am I thinking about myself? Is it all ruminating about me? Okay, and what does this yield? The more I think about myself, the unhappier I get. Oh, interesting. So it's all about turning inwards and starting to become aware of yourself. So that, if you start to make that a habit and you try to practice that throughout the day as frequently as you can, that's gold. You start with that. Then you ask yourself, what are the habits of my body, of my speech and mind that create unwanted results? What kind of actions am I constantly repeating on a daily basis, like negative self-talk? If you have addictive qualities, noticing how there's these addictive thought patterns that lead to addictive behaviors. If you have anxiety issues, notice how certain actions and certain behaviors actually exasperate and exaggerate your anxiety. So start to notice how you with your own habits are creating your own unhappiness. And once you notice that, this is where you will really need to flex your inner muscle. And that's the inner muscle of restraint. Once you notice your unwholesome or damaging or destructive habits, you start to make a sincere effort to restrain them. What does that mean? That means as soon as you're about to utter, like I have a client who keeps calling herself stupid. I'm training her to, as soon as she wants to say, oh, I'm so stupid, shut the mouth. Don't say it, right? Every time she manages to withhold that urge and not say it, she has had a victory over that habit. She has actually created, strengthened her muscle of restraint. She is actually empowering herself to then gradually reverse the habits, gradually. So when you become more skilled at restraining negative actions or negative habits, you then start to actually cultivate positive habits, which is a really fun and creative process where you deliberately take positive actions. So maybe in the beginning it's going to feel a little contrived, but in the case of that client, she is now learning to speak kindly about herself. She's now actually uttering words that affirm her inherent goodness, right? So that's a way of restraining a negative habit and empowering a positive new habit. And so gradually, we literally layer after layer, we thinning out the old habits, the reservoir of old negative habits, and we're empowering and filling up the reservoir of positive new habits, for which we need to know what are the new habits that we want to cultivate. We have to understand what does make me happy, right? So most of us don't even sit down to actually ask ourselves, what does make me happy? What do I need to engage in? What kind of actions do I need to engage in to lead me to a life of happiness or contentment? So getting really clear about that. And you know what? This takes a lot of awareness, as I said. It takes effort. It takes shitloads of resilience, because you're going to go off the path so many times and fail, and you're going to, want to throw in the towel and so forth. But if you can keep coming back and keep coming back, because there is nothing sweeter than this. There's nothing more gratifying than your own gradual emergence. If you can keep coming back, you're going to make it. And so awareness, effort, discipline, right? Discipline, absolutely needed. And one of my favorite quotes by a dancer called Gabrielle Roth is, it takes discipline to be a free spirit, right? It's not just about happy-go-lucky, I'm just gonna, whatever. It doesn't work like that. It's about repetition. From a simple neuroplasticity point of view, it's about repetition, it's about discipline, it's about perseverance, all those things. And you know what? The secret ingredient to it, so that you don't lose your energy and motivation, is joy. A lot of joy. You approach this process not with dread, not with a sense of like adolescent, like, oh, I have to do this because my mom told me. You choose it and you show up with joy. If you're not going to show up with joy, don't show up. Because if you show up with anything but joy, you're going to lack the energy to persevere. It's joy that keeps you on the path. And how do you get joy? How does the joy increase? The joy increases by you noticing your little victories. every single time you manage to hold the urge to say something unkind, you say, fuck yeah, well done to me. I just took a step towards my own healing or happiness. And that acknowledging of your little victories, of your defeating old negative patterns, that gives you the joy that you need to persevere and to continue. So joyful effort is so important. And I would say also community, you know, seeking honestly, if you were to look around, everybody suffers. Everybody suffers. And sometimes when we suffer, we think we're alone in our suffering. But I think if you were to really, really get a little bit more attuned with your own suffering, a little softer, a little more compassionate towards your own suffering, you will be so easily able to see that everyone suffers. Everyone has the same fears. Everyone has the same wish for happiness. Nobody wants to age. No one wants to get sick. No one wants to lose their loved ones. And look at the state of the world. So the more you become familiar and you become forgiving and you become compassionate with yourself, the more your heart also opens to the suffering of others, which makes your life then much more meaningful. Then you can respond and relate with other people on a basis of a shared humanity. And I think that's really where authentic connections can be built, and you feel like you're with other people in your experience as a human, seeking happiness, working towards happiness. So I want to just, I have 2 minutes and I want to end on the note of compassion. Yeah, so I would say that the more you're able to resonate and attune to your own suffering, and it's so, sometimes even the term suffering is so charged, we don't like to say it. The more you can do that, the more you're actually cultivating compassion for yourself, which really means being able to feel and relate with your own suffering and do something to alleviate it, the more you're able to be compassionate towards others. And I think that our world today is in dire need of compassion in action. So I would say start with yourself. And once you feel like you are relatively established in a state of wholeness or in a state of stability, you know how to regulate your own mind, then I would say extend your hand to other people. Of course, it's not a chronological thing that you don't help others, but I would say really make yourself a priority, make your healing a priority, and then you will be of true service, and your capacity will increase tremendously as well. So on that note, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm really grateful to have had this opportunity. All right. Have a wonderful life, everyone. Thank you.